Arroyo Grande's agricultural heritage is, of course, important to its history. That's what the Barn Museum showcases. Agriculture goes as far back as the Mission Fathers. Mission San Luis Obispo had orchard and vineyards in Corrales Canyon, and what we call Lopez Canyon, the Franciscan Fathers called La Cañada del Trigo, Wheat Canyon. But for modern agriculture, the starting place is with a ranchero, a cattle rancher, named Francis Branch. So that's a good place to start, with the arrival of Francis Branch in the Arroyo Grande Valley in 1837. For context, that was the first year of Queen Victoria's reign. So this exhibit in the Barn Museum commemorates the days of rancheros like Francis Branch and the days of his vaqueros. Some of the elements in the Dorothea Lange photograph of the 1939 cowboy on Los Osos Valley Road, who would have been instantly recognizable to a cowboy from 1839, some of those elements are on display here. Lower left, you see a pair of leather chops. If a calf ran into that monte, that thick willow scrub, the branches would quickly cut a cowboy's legs to pieces, so chaps were an absolute necessity in the Arroyo Grande Valley. The upper right, you see another feature that was in that photograph by Dorothea Lange, and that's a cowboy's staple, the riata, or the rope, very useful for fetching those stubborn calves who keep running into the monte. On the back wall is an assortment of bridles. The one on the left is the same one that was being used, the same type, in the Lange photograph. It's a bozal, or bitless bridle, that was a feature of Spanish, Mexican, and California horsemanship. Riders today who adhere to the vaquero tradition, many of them still use the bitless bridle. And on the right is an object that would have been near and dear to vaqueros, to buckaroos, to cowboys, period. and that is the dispensing the business part of a chuck wagon. Now, cooks would have been needed even on Rancho Santa Manuela in June, which was a terrible time to be a steer. That was roundup time. So cattle from the hills were brought into Santa Manuela, the calves to be branded, and the steers to be slaughtered. Again, in the 1830s, 40s, they were prized more for their hides than for their meat. So when a steer was slaughtered, its hide would be stripped, would be pegged to the ground, stretched out, and affixed to the ground with wooden pegs. Seawater would be poured over them. It would dry, and then the water would be applied again, till eventually the hides were about the same stiffness as a sheet of plywood. Then they would be carried down to a place like Cave Landing at what is today Port San Luis, and loaded onto Yankee brigs. Their ultimate destination, of course, again, was those shoe factories in Massachusetts. Hides were so valuable that they were commonly referred to as California dollars. Cattle ranching, of course, would not go away even after the disastrous drought of 1862 to 64. But dairy farming would suddenly become very important on the Central Coast. And this part of the barn exhibit commemorates the days of dairy farming. Three of the major players in dairy farming, a pursuit even Francis Branch was transitioning to at the time of his death. But the big players were the Steele brothers, originally from Santa Rosa. They came to San Luis Obispo County, bought up large chunks of the Rancho Santa Manuela, and began a dairying operation that eventually entailed 800 dairy cows. They made a fortune. San Luis Obispo County, by the turn of the century, was California's leading producer of cheese and second in the production of butter. The industry also attracted waves of immigrants, most notably from Switzerland, Italian Swiss, and from the Azores. One of my childhood friends, John Silva, once amazed me. He could name every Azorean American dairy farm between Lopez Canyon and the San Luis Obispo city limits. The tools of the trade are on display here. That's a cream separator, the bowl-like object. The ubiquitous milk can, useful for filling at 3 a.m. at left. And in the back, that's a yoke. And you see the woman in the photograph modeling one. Dairy farming was not for the faint of heart, nor for the weak of spine. One of those milk cans, when filled to the brim, weighed about 80 pounds. Another wave of settlers in the 1880s was made up of Civil War veterans. Nearly 60 are buried in the Arroyo Grande District Cemetery. 4 fought at Gettysburg. 7 accompanied Sherman on the march to the sea. 9 were present in the Appomattox campaign that ended the war in Virginia. The tombstone you see belongs to Wasna Valley farmer Otis Smith, who as a young man was awarded the Medal of Honor for his participation in seizing a Confederate battle flag at the Battle of Nashville in 1864. So most of these settlers would become farmers. And again, one of the things that attracted them was the railroad. It's a little PCRR locomotive on the Santa Margarita Ranch, which made farming here more practical and more profitable. Another element was the reputation of the Arroyo Grande Valley and the fertility of its soil. This is a newspaper clipping from Kansas. I've read others from South Carolina. One I read was in a Scottish newspaper, bragging about the fertility of the soil and the size of Arroyo Grande pumpkins. San Francisco, in early 1900s, the gas company raised its rates. And a reporter for the San Francisco Call wrote that complaints to the gas company grew faster than Arroyo Grande pumpkins. One of these veterans, who'd been a cavalryman under Custer in 1865, became Arroyo Grande's baby doctor. Another one, who'd fought in the Shenandoah Valley under Phil Sheridan, was a justice of the peace and the first town recorder when Arroyo Grande was incorporated in 1911. But by and large, the Barn Museum commemorates the vast majority of Civil War veterans who were farmers. Row crops, beans, peas were big in Arroyo Grande for many years, and tree crops. And so this plow, which looks a little bit like a John Deere, is part of a museum exhibit. That wonderful photograph is provided by the Waller family. The production of flower seed became a major industry in the Arroyo Grande Valley, and Waller Franklin seeds were known throughout the world. In fact, they outcompeted most major brands and were eventually banned from competition because Arroyo Grande flower seeds were too good for the rest of America. Well, somebody had to teach those farmers' kids, and this is one of the society's most valuable properties. It's the Santa Manuela Schoolhouse, which stood in Lopez Canyon. It's a classic example of a one-room Victorian Edwardian schoolhouse. The interior is preserved, so you can step back in time pretty easily by visiting this schoolhouse when it's open on Saturday afternoons. I feel a faint sense of superiority because my school in the upper Arroyo Grande Valley, Branch School, was twice as big as Santa Manuela. It had 2 classrooms. And we still had a few of these desks. We had no idea what the hole was for. We used ballpoint pens and those big green pencils. Of course, those were inkwells, and what they were intended for is, I am told, the dipping of little girls' pigtails. As a retired teacher, I heartily approve of the fact that the teacher's desk is on a raised platform. That indicates her sanctity, also allows her to keep an eye on those little rascals in her classroom. I'm sure the desk was cleared aside, and what the platform became was a stage for things like Christmas plays and commencement ceremonies, graduation from 8th grade, for example, where the entire class might consist of 2 people. This is the schoolhouse as it stood in Lopez Canyon. There were a dozen little country schools in the Arroyo Grande Valley and surrounding area, and that's because this was before the age of school buses. Kids had to walk to school or take a horse, which would be tethered outside. Sadly, this one-room school on Oak Park Road was destroyed many years ago by an arson fire, but it's a classic example of job insecurity in school teaching at the turn of the century. 5 teachers in 3 years. An important notice about watermelons, followed by Dr. Brown's opening school with 30 students. Dr. Brown was replaced by a Mr. Shaw from Los Angeles, who was replaced by Professor, thank you very much, Simpkins. Simpkins resigned his appointment because there were some grouches on his school board. He was replaced by C.F. Bonshu of San Jose, who in turn was replaced by Miss Celine Board. Salaries were not appetizing. This is 1901. The American Federation of Teachers, the powerful union, was formed in 1902. I think there could be a cause and effect there. Teachers themselves seemed to absolutely fascinate people. They became celebrities in many ways. Even teachers from the tiny Santa Manuela school appeared in the paper. Miss Hickman came to town with Mrs. Jatta, whose husband actually built that school in 1901. And if you wanted to know what Miss Stewart was doing for summer vacation, you could read all about it in a newspaper. And another Santa Manuela teacher, Miss Bailey, made a visit to the big city. That would be, of course, San Luis Obispo. Another teacher who taught at Santa Manuela in a previous schoolhouse, it burned and was replaced by the 1901 schoolhouse, was young Miss Clara Ganong. This appeared in the 1883 pages of the San Luis Obispo Morning Tribune and reports her attendance. Total number of students was 19, average attendance 15. The names are important. There's Joe Branch, Leroy Jatta. But there's two names, one of them circled. The last name is Hemme. Julius Hemme and his little sister Addie were two of Miss Ganong's students in 1883. 3 years later, Julius's life would take an immensely tragic turn. This replica tombstone in the Barn Museum, was part of an Eagle Scout project, records the death of P.J. Hemme 3 years after that report in the Morning Tribune. He was 15 and a half years old. He and his father were lynched from that railroad bridge at the base of Crown Hill over the Arroyo Grande Creek. The two had been accused of murdering neighbors, a young couple, over a land dispute. PJ was the trigger man. So in the dead of night, a crowd of masked men, vigilantes, broke into the little town jail, and they took PJ and his father out to the bridge and tossed them over the edge. Sadly, the people who discovered the bodies the next morning, April 1st, 1886, were school children walking on their way to school. Two years later, Clara left teaching. I don't know if there was cause and effect, but this is a clipping that commemorates her engagement, her marriage, in fact, to a Mr. Charles Wisman, who will make their home in San Miguel. Miss Ganong, it says, was very highly esteemed by her many friends. We all heartily join in wishing her good luck in her new venture. And a venture it would be. Sadly, she lost her husband in 1918, but at 75, she decided to have the adventure of a lifetime. She took a ship to England, and this is what London looked like at about the time Clara was 75 years old. The young school teacher, now an older woman, had some sand. This home, the Paulding History House, involves two generations of teachers and the town's first doctor, Ed Paulding. I'm going to step aside and let the Pauldings tell the story themselves. Heritage House is a home that dates back to about 1890, and it too is an important museum. But it's not just a museum. Happily, Heritage House serves a dual purpose. The beautiful gardens outside are a wedding venue. So, in this, one of the oldest homes in Arroyo Grande, young people begin their married lives here. Speaking of domestic life, this is my favorite room in Heritage House. See the two banks of windows above the sink. That room is always filled with light. It's beautiful. I like some of the appliances too. You can see a little coffee grinder atop the cupboard there. We had one just like it. There's a butter churn and some appliances date from the 1920s. Now, my mom was born in 1921, and I guess I'm a little old-fashioned. To my horror, and this is only about 3 weeks ago, I actually referred to our refrigerator as the ice box. So I guess that's why I kind of feel at home in this particular room. The kitchen's at the back of the house. This is the parlor in the front, and it's a lovely room. I love the overstuffed furniture, the intricately carved organ against the wall. You can see a kerosene lamp atop that lace tablecloth. But as is appropriate for a wedding venue, a member donated this beautiful wedding dress from about 1960. Now, if we go back in time, at the back of the house, in one of the bedrooms, there's this mannequin, a little scary because she's got kind of a Raggedy Ann face atop a normal human being's body, so it's a little discomforting to me. But she's got a blouse and skirt from the turn of the century. I love the hat boxes. You can pretend what hat is she going to wear that particular day. And below the table with that wonderful mirror, there are several pairs of women's shoes from the turn of the century. Those bother me too. They're pointy, and they look far too small for any normal human being's feet. I have decided that between those pointy, nasty shoes and the closing days of the whalebone corset, there is no way on God's green earth that I would have wanted to be a woman at the turn of the century. And now for something in terms of women's fashion completely different. This was worn by Ann Westerman. Westerman's father was a forest ranger in the Santa Lucia wilderness, so she grew up outdoors and came to love horses. She also taught at that one-room Santa Manuela schoolhouse at one point. And this exhibit is a good way to introduce Arroyo Grande has a remarkable history of horsewomen. Anne was one of them. It's branding time at a cattle ranch in Lopez Canyon. Sadly, it's now underwater, but there are 3 women, all horsewomen in this picture. The one on the left, that's her ranch. That's Mary Sid Spencer, a widow who ran Hereford on her Lopez Canyon ranch. And Sid was famous for the horse she's riding. It's a Morgan. In a world of quarter horses, Sid preferred Morgan horses. Now, that's Sid on the left. On the right, the woman appears to be riding a horse that's been run through the dryer too many times because it's shrunk. Well, that woman is Sid Spencer's sister, Ann Westerman. And where Sid preferred Morgans, Ann preferred Welsh ponies. And to coin a phrase, Welsh ponies are tough little dudes. It was Ann who made that costume that we saw in the Heritage House Museum. The woman in the center is my big sister, Roberta. She owned 2 Morgans bred by Sid Spencer and 2 Welsh ponies bred by Ann Westerman. And those Welsh ponies, Roberta had a pony cart, those things could zip along at a really nice clip. In 1945, the American Third Army commander George Patton, famous for naughty things, did one more. Soviet troops were approaching his stables in Czechoslovakia, which included the famed Lipizzaner of the Spanish riding school in Vienna, and also some of the most prized champion Arabs in Europe. To deny the Soviets the capture of these horses, Patton, under the table, authorized an American regiment to go in and bring them back to American lines. So that was called Operation Cowboy. And this is a photograph of the Lipizzaner and the Arabs being evacuated to safety. The problem was the Red Army was advancing quickly. Patton sent his detachment into Czechoslovakia, which was in the Soviet sphere of influence. Americans had no business being there. But the problem was, as they were advancing, the Red Army was eating horses. So Patton's under-the-table order meant that the Lipizzaner would survive. It was a German POW, an officer, who was panic-stricken about what might happen to these wonderful horses. He told an American officer, please do something so they don't become horse burgers. The horse leading the column of refugees away from the Russians and toward Patton's lines was this one. Vitez, it is said, was rather proud of himself that day to be at the head of the line. His name translates as hero. In 1939, when he was a colt, he was escaping from the Germans, not the Russians. Then the column of refugees, which included many horses, was attacked by German fighters. The horses panicked, ran into the woods, and Vitez was gone for 3 days before a Polish farmer returned him to his handlers. 6 years later, Vitez's brother, Stained Glass, was likewise being evacuated away from the Russians when he and his stablemates arrived in Dresden the night of the Allied firebombing of the ancient city. Several of the Arabians were killed. Stained Glass's handler watched in horror as his horse's tail spontaneously burst into flames. Stained Glass would survive, and so would his brother Vitez, who became a prize of war. He was on a Liberty ship being transported to the United States after the war when the ship ran into a horrific storm in the Bay of Biscay. While the other horses below deck panicked, Vitez alone was a kind of a isolated spot of calm. He had his forelegs splayed and was staring fiercely at the floor, determined to keep calm and to keep his balance on the heaving deck. So maybe Vitez was exactly the right name for him. I love underdog stories. This is, I guess, an under-horse story. Rontesa, by the way, loved to compete. Sheila recorded of her experience at the Cow Palace that she knew Rontesa was ready because she could feel the mare's heartbeat against her thigh beneath the panels of the saddle. Rontesa was excited, ready to go. I found this wonderful book about the evacuation of the horses by Patton's Third Army. It's called The Perfect Horse by Elizabeth Letts. This is where I learned about the Arabian Vites. I had a hunch, so I did a little research, and it turned out that because of Rontesa, Vites has a connection to our history, too. In another room in Heritage House, there's this display of military uniforms. On the far left, a Marine uniform that reminds me of John Loomis, who was all of 19 years old when he served in the horrific Battle of Okinawa. On the far right is the Army uniform worn by Asa Porter, who served in New Guinea, where even the birds are venomous. The Air Force uniform, I believe, belonged to Douglas Sage, a community leader, businessman, member of the society who served in Korea. But it's the uniform in the oval, another Marine uniform, but obviously a woman's uniform that I'm interested in. The Marine who wore that uniform was named Thelma Murray Glenn. Thelma Murray Glenn became a Marine because of her little brother. George died at the Battle of Tarawa. It was the first major amphibious operation undertaken by the Americans in World War II. What it proved was we had a lot to learn. The Higgins boats, the flat-bottom boats that ferried troops ashore, could not surmount the coral reef at Tarawa, so they circled for hours before the tide was high enough for them to get over it and onto the beach. By then, I'm sure George and his fellow Marines were thoroughly seasick. They got to the beach, the landing ramp went down, and 20-year-old George Murray was killed almost instantly. George's mother was named Edith. His big sister was Thelma. So to honor her brother, Thelma became a Marine, and this composite photo was made for their mom. Not only was Thelma a Marine, she was a good one. You can see she was a staff sergeant. Those are sergeant stripes on her sleeve. Thelma would be sent to Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, where she would be assigned to the camp motor pool. She was a driver, and she was a good one. In December of 1944, a VIP was to arrive on a tour of Camp Lejeune, and Thelma Murray Glenn was assigned to be his chauffeur that day because she was so good at her job. And the VIP, to his credit, loved dogs, and Camp Lejeune was a center for training Marine dogs, so he wanted to meet some of the dogs. He also wanted to meet some of the young men who were about to graduate from Officers Candidate School. So Thelma was his assigned driver for the day, and she was under orders for him to talk to the young officer candidates. She had to virtually drive up to their shoe tips. The problem was her VIP couldn't get out of the car. Thelma's passenger couldn't get out of the car because he was paralyzed. In a way, Thelma Murray Glenn lost her little brother George twice. He was, of course, killed on the beach at Tarawa. He was buried in a very rudimentary cemetery, like this Marine cemetery, on Tarawa. And then the island was left to its own devices in 1943. At war's end, Army Corps of Engineers teams would arrive to survey, mark out, delineate the cemeteries to prepare the Marines' remains for repatriation home. But after 2 years, erosion had done its work. Some of the cemeteries had simply vanished. and George Murray was among the lost Marines of Tarawa. Eventually, with the help of modern technology like ground penetrating radar, many of those Marines' remains were recovered. They were brought to a forensics lab run by the military in Hawaii that's specifically geared toward the identification of missing in action soldiers, Marines, and sailors. It was Linda Austin of the Oceano Train Depot, she's the curator of that wonderful museum, who kept on the military, pressed and visited Hawaii at least once to find her townmate, George Murray of Oceano. Eventually, he was identified, and he would come home to Arroyo Grande after dying in 1943. He came home in 2017. So this is just one of the stories that the museums of the South County Historical Society has to tell. It's a little town, but it's got a big history.